Hi, fifth graders. Welcome back to our next day of reading the Fabled fourth graders of ESEP Elementary. I have a special guest with us today, little Maggie Ruth. We'll see how well she behaves during this reading. Chapter 3, An Absent-Minded Morning. On the second day of school, Mr. Jupiter took attendance. Raise your hand if you're not here, he said. The children looked at one another. Then Jackie's hand shot into the air. I'm not here, she snickered. I've gone to the National Tetherball Tournament to see the Hoboken Blowfish take on the Altoona Poodles. The other students giggled, but Mr. Jupiter calmly said, a reasonable excuse. He wrote Jackie's name on the attendance slip. Then he asked, is anyone else absent? Me, said Bruce. I'm staying home to play Meteor Monsters. Yeah, added Lenny, and I'm staying home with him. After all, the two-player version is the best. Perfectly understandable, said Mr. Jupiter. He wrote their names down too. I couldn't come to school today either, said Victoria. I'm having a facial. I see, said Mr. Jupiter. And I couldn't come because I'm watching cartoons, said Emberly. Of course, said Mr. Jupiter. And I couldn't come because I ate too many hot dogs and got a stomachache, said Ham. Oh, my sympathies, said Mr. Jupiter. Melvin waved his hand in the air. Ask me why I'm not here, he cried. The others ignored him. Ask me, cried Calvin. Why aren't you here, asked Mr. Jupiter. Because I don't like school, replied Calvin. Hey, hollered Lenny. That's why I'm not here. Get serious, snorted Stanford. You already said you were playing video games with Bruce. For your information, Mr. Know-It-All Smarty Pants, I'm absent because I'm playing video games with Bruce and because I don't like school. That's too bad, said Mr. Jupiter. He wrote all their names on his attendance slip. Is anyone else absent? We are, cried Ashley A and Ashley B. Add me, added Ashley Z. And me, repeated Humphrey. Mr. Jupiter took down their names. Then he pointed at Rose. Are you here? No, answered Rose. I overslept. What about you? Mr. Jupiter asked Missy. Missy shook her head. I got lost on the way to school. And you? Mr. Jupiter looked at Rachel. Said Rachel. Beg your pardon? Said Mr. Jupiter. Rachel said again. I'm sorry, said Mr. Jupiter. What? Rachel said. Mr. Jupiter shrugged and added her name to the slip. I'm not either, Bernadette said with a dramatic sigh. I just wasn't in the mood. Hey, cried Lenny, that's why I'm not here, because I wasn't in the mood and I don't like school and I'm playing video games with Bruce. Stanford snorted. Get serious. Lenny smirked. Get lost. And Amisha raised her hand. Don't forget about me, she said. I'm not here either. Why not? Asked Mr. Jupiter. Amisha thought a moment. I'm visiting my grandparents in Calcutta, she finally said. Beautiful city, remarked Mr. Jupiter. I once worked as an elephant trainer there. Amisha smiled as Lil burst into verse. I'm writing a poem, so I can't come to school. I hope you'll forgive me for being so cruel. Of course I will, said Mr. Jupiter. He wrote the last of the names on his attendance slip. Then he looked around the classroom. Isn't anyone here today? Lenny shook his head. It looks like you're all by yourself. Actually, said Mr. Jupiter, I'm not here either. You're not, said Bernadette. No, said Mr. Jupiter. I'm trekking through the Amazon rainforest in search of the rare and elusive golden-throated rabbit squirrel. You are? Said Amisha. I am, said Mr. Jupiter. But don't worry, I have a substitute. He plopped a human skull onto his desk. The children stared wide-eyed. This is Mrs. York, Mr. Jupiter exclaimed. I found her on an archaeological dig along the Solo River in Java. The children kept staring. Mrs. York, continued Mr. Jupiter, is never absent. Can you guess why? The children shook their heads. Because, he said, she doesn't have any body to go out with. For one moment, the children sat in silence. Then Calvin chuckled. Victoria giggled. Soon all the children were rocking with laughter. Nobody, howled Lenny. That's a good one, Mr. Jupiter. Thank you, Leonard, said Mr. Jupiter. I thought it was pretty funny myself. And he laughed until his sides ached and his eyes teared. Then they all got down to work. Moral of the story: he laughs best who laughs last. Chapter 4, The Librarian in Love. Miss Paige Turner, the school librarian, was busily cataloging new materials and reshelving books. Already she had hung her favorite poster on the wall behind the circulation desk. It read, "There is a place for every book, and every book has its place." Miss Turner considered Turner considered this her motto. She loved nothing better than arranging her books neatly and numerically on the library shelves. "Ah, the Dewey Decimal System," she gushed as she stood back to admire her handiwork. "Humankind's single greatest achievement." Then she turned to her other tasks, her sensible brown loafers making a satisfying shh sound as she bustled around the library. An hour earlier, the place had been crawling with students looking for The Cat in the Hat, Ramona the Pest, and books about dinosaurs. But now the library was quiet as a museum again, just the way Miss Turner liked it. Then Mrs. Struggles walked in. "Paige," she said, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Jupiter." Annoyed at having her silence disturbed, Miss Turner frowned and looked up from her magazine rack she'd been arranging. She found herself looking into the most beautiful pair of brown eyes in the whole world. Instinctively, Miss Turner straightened her cardigan, the one with apples appliqued onto its pockets. She tucked back a strand of mouse-brown hair and pushed up her wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Jupiter smiled a dazzling smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "Mr. Jupiter's our new fourth-grade teacher," explained Mrs. Struggles. Miss Turner managed a weak "Hello." She felt like a scoop of vanilla ice cream on a hot summer's day, all sweet and drippy. Mr. Jupiter leaned closer. "I look forward to working with you," he said. His voice caressed Miss Turner's pale skin like a soft spring breeze. "Oh, me too," she breathed. Mr. Jupiter leaned even closer. He was so close the librarian could see the gold flecks in his eyes. "One more thing," he said. "Anything," sighed Miss Turner. "I would like to check out a copy of Aesop's Fables," he said. "Do I need to fill out a card?" "What?" Miss Turner blinked. She felt blinded by his beauty. "Oh, no. Take a copy. That's fine." Mrs. Struggles raised her eyebrows. Miss Turner was always such a stickler for proper checkout procedures. What was going on here? "Thank you," said Mr. Jupiter. He touched the back of her hand. "And when, may I ask, is it due?" His touch jolted her senses. She felt confused, dizzy, electrified. "Due?" she managed to croak. "Whenever." Mrs. Struggles shook her head in disbelief. Miss Turner detested overdue books. Why, any student who didn't return a book within 14 days was hunted down and fined. Mr. Jupiter smiled again. "That is very generous of you, Paige. May I call you Paige?" The sound of her name on his lips made her shiver. "Of course. Mr. Jupiter," said Mrs. Struggles, "let me introduce you to our music teacher." She led him out the door. Miss Turner stood there for a moment, dazed. Then she collapsed into her swivel chair. It rolled across the floor and crashed into his shelving cart. She barely noticed. Her heart raced, and feeling of wild abandonment shot through her. Suddenly, she longed to kayak down the Congo River, parachute off the entire Empire State Building, read a trashy romance novel. With trembling hands, the librarian reached into her "so many books, so little time" book bag and pawed around until she found her compact. Snapping it open, she gazed at her reflection in the tiny mirror. Just as she suspected, nothing had changed. And yet, Miss Turner shook her head. How odd. On the outside, she looked exactly the same. But on the inside, she felt like a brand new woman. Moral of the story: you can't judge a book by its cover.